So I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Gadigal people, and pay my respects to elders past and present. So my name's Leonie King. I'm currently at Evolve Housing, which is actually about a block and a half away from the Aboriginal Housing Office in Parramatta. And so, needless to say, I think we pride ourselves on having a reasonably good relationship. My background, I've spent the past 2 years before I came into Evolve in the disability and community care space, and so for a period of time I was responsible for Aboriginal home care services, which we then moved into the non-government sector. Before that, I spent 8 years responsible for the mainstream community housing sector with a government hat on, so in the, what is now FACS, but was then the department. So I can take responsibility for the Community Housing for Aboriginal People plan. And the thinking at the time, back in 2011, was that we wanted to improve the representation of Aboriginal people and their access to mainstream community housing. So recognising there was an Aboriginal community housing sector, but more importantly recognising perhaps that they weren't necessarily having the same opportunities and the same choice about where they wanted to live. So I think it was fair to say a good idea at the time. And following on from that, my team in government, the division developed and worked closely with the Federation at the time, the Aboriginal Cultural Competency Standards. So 3 or 4 or 5 years later, I'm in the sector, back in housing, which is where my passion is, in a mainstream community housing provider. And I walk in the door and I look around and I go, what are we doing around Aboriginal access and Aboriginal cultural competency? And we've probably heard a bit about what's happened, and I think it's fair to say we're not doing enough. So there's a lot of commitment in an organisation such as ours and our many mainstream colleagues in the sector. But one of the things that has been a good lesson for me in moving into the non-government sector, and I'm sure you will all relate, is that initiatives and ideas come down from government, and organisations such as your sector and ours are not always resourced properly to do that. Now that's a matter of prioritising resources, and that's a matter of thinking about how we do stuff, but I'll just move forward. So we're one of the larger organisations in New South Wales, I think it's fair to say. We've got around 3,000 social, affordable and private market housing properties. What's private market doing there? So we have a team called the Private Market Team, which manage mostly affordable and some private housing, and they do that on a fee-for-service basis. And we operate across some 25 LGAs. Significantly, the clients or our tenants come from a range of very, very different cultures. And so probably the Aboriginal representation is on the lower side, and we would have far more people who are tenants who are from Vietnam, from Korea, from Lebanon, etc. So one of the other things that's been I've noticed as I've come into this organisation is thinking about how we appropriately communicate and engage with and target our services for a range of people from different cultural backgrounds. We have quite a diverse set of staff. Would it be representative? Not necessarily, but certainly, and I think most organisations in the not-for-profit sector would say that. We also run a youth homelessness service, Evolve Housing for Youth, formerly Western Housing for Youth. So what's my learned experiences? Organisational history shapes perceptions. So Evolve came about as a merger of 2 smaller community housing providers some years ago. And obviously, as part of that evolution, it's expanded its footprint. As part of its fee-for-service business, it's certainly taken on many more properties in many more different locations. And fairly recently, for our sins, we've stepped into the mid-north coast and imminently the Hunter in the disability space. That's probably my fault, but never mind. Obviously, when you have quite a vast spread and a very dispersed and I guess, a multicultural tenant base, it makes it really, really hard to work out how to position your engagement and to work out how you position and develop programs and to think about how you best target those multiplicity of audiences. And while, as I said, we are particularly known, I think, for our multicultural tenant base, I think many of the other community housing providers in the mainstream sector would have similar issues. And I would say one of the things that was kind of a blessing and perhaps not when I stepped into disability is people get disability. They get that there is a group of people with a disability. Now, disability itself and the types of disabilities are very, very diverse. When you come back into the housing space, it's people who are first and foremost on low incomes, and then they can have a range of very, very different needs. And I know people working in housing have always struggled to pitch and direct and focus where your efforts lie because you have people with multiple needs. You've got people from different ethnic backgrounds. So it's quite tricky. So I think as we've started to look at this Aboriginal cultural competency and pick it back up again, we've gone, how do we understand, it's not just Aboriginal people, it's Aboriginal communities, and each community has its own characteristics, its own ways of operating, its own history, to pick up your point. And so that's quite a challenge for us. And I know I've had some brief conversations with some people in the AHO before going, how would we find out about the specifics of these communities in Western Sydney? And so if there's anybody who's done that work, that'd be fabulous, because it really is actually quite challenging to work through that and access the information you need. Property allocation. So if you go back to the Aboriginal Access Strategy, which is all about improving the access of Aboriginal people into mainstream community housing, for those who chose that as a path, property allocations are shaped by location and express demand. And so certainly in Parramatta, I think our observations would be, that's where our head office is, but most people still go to the local FACS housing office in Parramatta to seek housing. And so they don't come through our door. So when you have targets around increasing the representation of Aboriginal people in your community, it is a product of things like where you're physically located, how people understand how to access. As we see that whole housing pathway system change and people increasingly do it online, I think, and apply online, I think that will change. But historically and fairly recently, it was very heavily foot traffic based. You came into a local office and you applied. How to be responsive to a range of community and cultural groups I've touched upon. As I said, we're grappling with that now. And if we take some of our other cultural groups as well, even they aren't discrete and homogenous, because you can have very different dynamics within a family household. So you take a family where the parents have migrated and they have particular cultural norms and ways of operating. Their children were born here and they have a very different approach. And so we've been starting to think about, and I would not say it's easy, about just understanding the total household, not just the lead or head tenant. So as part of that, we've said we're not just about housing people, and we've developed a social outcomes framework. And in trying to understand the needs of our clients, we've actually said, how are we going to do that? So if any of you are familiar with housing pathways and the application system for the mainstream sector, you don't get a lot of data. The data we collect, the information recorded, is largely based on people's income and whether they're, their main source of funding or income. So we don't know a lot about our households. We collect some information through surveys and things, but we don't have a lot of detail, and that is actually a significant impediment to organisations such as ours. So we've started a process. It's the beginning of a long journey, hopefully not, was it 13 years, Adele, around personal support planning. And so it literally just started a few months back. As people come in the door for a vacancy, we sit them down, we ask them a series of questions. We try and work out what supports they already have, what supports they might need, and that could be anything from mental health support. That could actually be access and brokering into training and employment. And again, none of that is easy either, but we don't actually have the intelligence and the information we need to actually understand a household's needs. So we've started that process. What we haven't got to, but what we have recognised, and certainly my team has been in discussion with the Federation and Adele, is just do we need to change some of those questions again to reflect some of that history and some of the background for different cultural groups, including Aboriginal people. And I've touched upon the Aboriginal Access Plan. So I would say, as I said, we've started on the journey to much more proactively thinking about how we meet those Aboriginal cultural competency standards with a view, hopefully, ultimately, to get to a reconciliation action plan. It can't be a desktop process. As I said, the organisation has a lot of commitment and was committed in the past to the Aboriginal access strategy, but it actually needs ongoing focus. And because you're spread very thinly in organisations, as you well know, and particularly with all the changes in direction that come down from government and changes in reform and the need to comply with the national regulatory standards, in my mind, the only way this is going to work is to continue to have a dedicated officer that pushes this, that keeps moving it forward, because it needs a lot of attention and a lot of nurturing, I think. And I think that's possibly the mistake some of us have made in the past. It doesn't just get turned into business as usual overnight. And as I said, actually really understanding the nuances of the different communities is also, and community groups, is important. The other thing I'll touch upon very, very briefly is as part of that journey for us, and I said we're just down the road from the Aboriginal Housing Office, is we've got a formal partnership with the AHO around affordable housing. So this is an exercise, I think, on both parts, just to learn a bit about how that might work. The AHO has purchased 8 properties out in outer Western Sydney in a mixed tenure development. We happen to be the owner of NRAS subsidies, for those of you familiar with that program that unfortunately has been discontinued by the Commonwealth. So under that, we're passing on the value of those incentives to the Aboriginal Housing Office. We're managing it as a managing agent with some discrete policy settings, and I think this is a learning exercise for both of us in the space of affordable housing and under development as a further 10 projects. So that's a step, a toe in the water for the Aboriginal Housing Office, and it's a good ability for us to, it's not just about them learning from us about affordable housing, of which we manage, about 600 properties, but it's actually good for us to understand the specifics and the nuances in the Aboriginal housing sector. And in case you're wondering what it looks like, those are the first, it's in a complex, that's where the first affordable housing, 8 affordable housing properties owned by the AHO are. So that wasn't our development, that was a private market development. But just to give you a sense of some of our conversations and relationships. That's me.